Welcome everyone to History Revealed, Closing Time with Bill Lindike and Andy Sturdevant, sponsored by the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. Please see the websites that are on the slide. Click on those for more information on upcoming programs. And I'm going to stop the screen share, turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library.
Thank you, Robin, and I'm delighted to be here representing the library. We've had a great run with Ramsey County Historical Society, co-sponsoring these programs, History Revealed, virtually every month. The Eastside Freedom Library is now 6 years and a couple months old. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. We combine the resources of books, material objects, musical recordings, visual art, with programming. These days, almost all of our programming is online. I want to invite you to, as Robin said, visit our website, see what's coming up. Tomorrow night is our monthly labor history film. We're showing a film called Up South about African-American migration at the time of World War I. Next week, we have a labor history reading group meeting, reading an unpublished essay about dining car waiters in the Twin Cities. So there's lots of untold stories that we're trying to tell and ways that we're trying to involve various members of our communities. So I want to thank Andy and Bill for their willingness to do this tonight, and thank Robin and Chad and the Ramsey County Historical Society for being great partners. And I'm sure we're all in for a great ride this evening as we explore closing time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library. We appreciate their partnership and working with Peter and with Clarence and all the volunteers at the Eastside Freedom Library. We, as Peter mentioned, have been partners in programming for about 2 years now. And we will be working with the Eastside Freedom Library to present a number of programs on suffrage in conjunction with our upcoming exhibition, Persistence Continuing: The Struggle for Suffrage and Equality from 1848 to 2020. Please see our website at www.rchs.com for more information on the exhibition, which will be premiered on our website on October 8th at a very special event. And everyone is welcome to sign up for that free Zoom event, which will be a lot of fun. We will be talking to the artist who created special artwork for that exhibition. So again, see our website at rchs.com for that. And please also consider supporting the Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Historical Society. Both of our organizations rely on the support of our members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and continue with all of our efforts. So let me turn it over to Andy and Bill. I have a brief introduction. Bill Lindike, PhD, is an urban geographer and writer who focuses on how our environments shape our lives. He wrote MinPost's Cityscapes column from 2014 to 2017, has written articles on local food and drink history for City Pages and The Growler, and has taught urban geography at the University of Minnesota and Metro State University. He writes a local urban blog at Twin Cities Sidewalks and is a member of the St. Paul Planning Commission. He is the author of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Then and Now, and of course, Closing Time. Andy Sturdevant is an artist and writer living in Minneapolis. He has written about art, history, and culture for a variety of publications, including City Pages, Belt, and Minneapolis St. Paul. He currently writes a regular column for Architecture MN, and for 5 years, Andy wrote The Stroll, which was a great weekly column on Twin Cities neighborhoods, art, history, and architecture for MinPost. He is the author of Potluck Supper with Meeting to Follow, as well as Downtown, Minneapolis in the 70s, and of course, in conjunction with Bill Lindike, Closing Time. So welcome, Andy and Bill.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Robin.
Thank you.
It's actually lovely to be back here at the Eastside Freedom Library because This is where I met the editor for this book, Josh Leventhal from the Historical Society Press. You remember that night, Andy?
I do. That's right. Yeah, you were giving a presentation not unlike the one that we are about to embark upon.
Yeah, and I do believe it was the first time that Peter had been to the dive bar a block away from the library. We dragged him to it afterwards, a little bit reluctantly, I think, but a good time was had by all. It's kind of sad to be talking about bars right now because they technically are open, but I haven't been to any except for one patio experience just because of the coronavirus. And I fear for the future of a lot of the places that are still open that are in our book.
Actually, two of them, I think, have ceased to exist in the time between now and when the book was published last fall.
Yeah, that's true, but it's because of the George Floyd unrest rather than the pandemic, I believe.
That's true, yeah. But so folks, we have you here for 50 minutes, and what Bill and I are going to do here, and we can kind of do this however you'd like. It's your evening. We both picked 5 bars each from the book for a total of 10 bars, and we're just going to kind of quickly go through them roughly in chronological order. We tried to spread them around St. Paul in Minneapolis. We tell you a little bit about how the book came together, and that'll inform some of what we discuss over the next 50 minutes together. But the Historical Society Press approached us a couple years ago about doing this book. There'd really never been like a kind of survey of bars in the Twin Cities, kind of going all the way back to the 1840s to the present. There had been some academic texts, and there was actually a really good thesis, like it was a PhD thesis, Bill, that came out, I don't know.
Yes, indeed. It was a geography department thesis. So it was my historical colleague of mine in the geography department.
I'm looking at it right now, Bill. It's on my shelf. I need to.
Yeah, you still haven't given that back to me, Andy.
It's like one of 4 copies in existence. So what we did is Bill and I went out to a couple of bars over the course of a few weeks, and really just kind of made like a master list of places that we wanted to get, places we thought might be interesting to write about, and types of places that we knew existed but didn't know exactly what they were. Like, what was a woman-owned bar in the in the 19 teens. And so working from that list, we more or less split it down the middle, and
it was actually sort of a fantasy football style draft process where we picked number 1 choices, and then that's how it went, I believe.
And a lot of it just had to do with like which bars we had the best photos of. Like there was a couple places I wanted to write about, and we just couldn't find photos of them. Because that's the thing when you're researching a book like this, you realize like photos of these places, if they exist, it's generally for like insurance purposes, or they are tucked away in somebody's house, like the grandchild or great grandchild of the original owner. And in some cases, the photos are like on the walls of the places if they're still around. But a lot of this stuff doesn't kind of make it into the formal historical record, which is one of the reasons we really wanted to write this book, because there's so many ways. Ooh, pardon me there. I'm drinking a beer, as you may have noticed. So I will.
Cheers, Andy. So am I.
Cheers to you too, Bill. But when you're looking at history of the bars, you're looking at history of immigration and labor and race relations and socioeconomic status of various neighborhoods and gentrification. And it's really this lens that you can look at any number of ways to think about how a city works and how the people in that city relate to each other. And it tends to be a history that, again, doesn't really make it into the formal histories, unless a PhD student in the geography department in 1980 writes a history of it, in which case, great. But so getting some of those stories is what we really wanted to focus on. And so, yeah, do you want to?
I think the list also had sort of a spread of geography and time. So we definitely wanted to have some stuff from the very early colonization of these cities that we're in, and stretching all the way to the present day and bringing it to the present moment, but also spreading out the geography as well. So having a mix of bars from different places around St. Paul and Minneapolis, making sure all the neighborhoods got represented a little bit.
Yeah, or most of the neighborhoods. I mean, 50 sounds like a lot, but actually it's, it goes, those slots got taken pretty quickly. All right, I'm going to jump over into the old presentation, Bill. Like I said, Bill's got 5, I've got 5, and we'll just kind of do this. And I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have questions or comments or things that you wish to express to Bill and I, please put them in the chat, and I will give voice to those.
Yeah, so the American House was one of the earliest bars in the book. We started with a couple saloons from the 1850s, but the American House had been around from the 1860s to 1883. And it was featured in a lot of the newspapers because it was a block from the offices of the St. Paul Globe, which was sort of newspapers back in the 19th century were very florid and colorful. And so the descriptions of the American House that we found in the record there are just amazing. The other reason that it's in the book is because there was photo of it. So do you want to jump to that, Andy? Yeah. So like it's pretty rare to see a photo like this, to find this in the Historical Society archive. And I love this picture. You can see the people up on the second floor. So a lot of the saloons were hotels, right? At the same time that they were a bar, and the folks gathered here are, I think this photograph is from 1873. So St. Paul in 1873 was just at the beginning of the railroad sort of connections, where it was booming, but there was also a financial panic, and so people are out here for all sorts of reasons, but immigrating to St. Paul, and they would often come to the American House. And so if you look through the city directories, which are an excellent historical resource that I think both Andy and I and everyone at the Historical Society or the Ramsey County use, but you see all these ads for all the different businesses, and then there's sort of addresses of the different people. And a lot of folks just put their address as the American House. So if you were coming to St. Paul, to Minnesota, to make a land claim or whatever, you would stay at the American House for a while to sell some property or to buy some property or whatever. And then the saloon would be where everyone would hang out and discuss all the matters of the day that were important. So this photo is really the reason why we put this in the book. Also, the idea of American had a different valence back then. So American sort of referred to, this would be in contrast to like the German house, the Deutsches Haus, which was also like a place in St. Paul. It was located right near where the state capitol is today. But the American House would be sort of for the Yankees, right? And then the Deutsches Haus would be for the Germans, and there maybe would be a Swedish house or something like that too down the street somewhere. But I'll just read this really quick newspaper account of a story from Election Day, 1878. Okay, because I love this tale. So there was an article in the St. Paul Globe that led the front page in 1878, and the article headline was "Gill Filler Gobbled," which is a little weird. So gill like a fish, gill filler gobbled. Here's the detail. A knockdown, drag-out row with parties engaged in the passage of the compliments of the early morn. Tom McGovern, an employee of the waterworks, had been out all night electioneering. The fatigues of the night's work forced McGovern to go into the barroom of the American House to brace up. There he met Kelly. Kelly's eyes wooed up as if he too had been electioneering, or more likely, as if he had been electioneered. They discussed the situation and slightly differed as to which was the true policy to be adopted in running the governmental machine. High words and very low language led to blows. In the struggling, they got into an adjoining card room. The door was locked, and they proceeded with all their fun, all alone, depriving several bystanders of the delight in the exhibition. In the midst of the political discussion, Officer Kennelly came along and arrested both disputants before the argument had been fully completed. Kelly seemed to have some strong points, and McGovern also appeared to have responded with force. So it is an election season right now as well, and I think we have sort of returned to this level of polity here in the United States and in Minnesota. But yeah, the American House was a place where there's a piano in the corner where the old-timey guy is banging on it, and people are constantly getting into brawls. And when you walked in, like through the swinging door, it looks like that is a literal swinging door on the corner there. People would turn and look at you funny if you weren't from around here. And it was just all the cliches of the Wild West, and it was pretty funny, I think, to imagine St. Paul being like that. So it's a good story, and it's definitely a fun image.
Bill, there's a question here kind of related to this. How many people, this is from Stephen Griffith, how many people would a typical bar of this period hold? And would there be tables and chairs, or would it only be standing room?
Well, there was definitely, so this is a good question, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, the way that I actually went to New York City while I was writing the book, and I went to this place called McSorley's Pub, which is in the East Village area. And it claims to be, and it seems very much like a 19th century saloon that's been preserved in sawdust, not in amber, but in sawdust. And you walk in there and you can really get a sense of what the atmosphere for a saloon like this might have been like. And yes, people would definitely have gotten their mail sent there. And then also there were tables, and so there would be meals served. So if you stayed at the American House, you would come down to the saloon area. There's probably a bar area and then a back room where the fight took place in this case, right? Where people would eat their meals during the morning, and presumably a dinner time meal. I don't know how many meals you get when you're staying at the hotel. But yeah, it wasn't always brawls. The brawls made the newspaper, and the time that the bartender threw a glass at someone who called him a name, and he stumbled out of there bleeding and fell down in the street. That's in the newspaper.
Yeah, the reason why we know what so many of these places looked like on the inside is because reporters, especially from places like the St. Paul Globe, which was very, took a very, colorful view of kinds of events around town. Reporters would go in there and just kind of hang out. And if they were looking for a story, they would, talk to a couple of the folks there and see what was going on, and just kind of paint these florid pictures of the velvet wallpaper and the fixtures and all this other sort of stuff.
Yeah, and the saloons were owned by, this one was owned by a specific person that's in my notes, Gil Potgeiser. And so he owned this bar, this saloon, and then I think he owned a place across the street after this place was closed. It finally got torn down, and this is where the Lowry building is located today. So probably in the 1880s, when St. Paul was really in its peak boom years, and new buildings were getting thrown up left and right. And so this corner of the city was definitely the hot property. And that's all about the American House. Okay.
Yeah, a little slow there. Thanks. And so this is the Eureka bar at 5th and Minnesota from 1887 to 1899. Don't have any pictures of it. Could not find any pictures of it. They may be out there, but I sure couldn't find them. But when we were writing this book, one of the great pleasures of it was just meeting these really interesting people. And this is one of the interesting people that we met. This is Thomas Jefferson Sr., who was the co-owner of the Eureka bar. It was owned by him and another guy named John Cunningham, who had moved from the South in the 1870s, 1880s to St. Paul, and kind of became two of the focal points of the African American community at the time. And the Eureka was the bar that they both ran together. It had three different locations over the course of the decade or so that it was open. But just in the accounts of it, you really get a sense for what a kind of social and political and in every other way kind of hub for the Black community in St. Paul at the time. And you start to see the kind of really interesting intersections between people's lives and what goes on at the bars. At the time, St. Paul was a very democratic city, and Minneapolis was a very Republican city, and bars really did have political affiliations. And one of the things about Jefferson and Cunningham that was so interesting is that they were two of the first Black Minnesotans that switched their allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And so that was just a big kind of to-do. And there was a lot of conversation about that. And these two guys were really involved in the life of the community. With the lack of a kind of a social safety net, the bars became places where you could cash a paycheck, or you could get, you know, in some cases a loan if you were in need of one. And even kind of mutual aid societies, and mutual aid is one of these things that we hear so much about now in the last couple months. And there were mutual aid societies or mutual aid like societies that were going on in places like the Eureka. You know, there were all these accounts of if somebody got sick, then, you know, Cunningham would pay for the doctor's bill, and if somebody died, then Cunningham would pay for the funeral, and have some money for the widow that they would raise through the, you know, through the folks at the bar. So the Eureka bar just really, it really felt like a, you know, just kind of getting to know these guys and getting a sense for, you know, what their lives was like just through these snapshots. The reason I was able to find so much about the Eureka bar in particular is because a lot of the research process had to do with what newspapers were digitized and what newspapers were not. The St. Paul Appeal, which was the Black-owned newspaper in St. Paul in the late 19th century and early 20th century, is digitized. So you could find, you know, advertisements and all of this kind of thing. You could find these little snippets of accounts, and then just kind of over the course of you know, the research, you could kind of put a picture together. And there were these really kind of, you know, beautiful and sad stories too. Cunningham, Jefferson's partner here, he you know, had a common law wife, and there was a newspaper story about how he, you know, called his wife to his side as he was sick, and they got married, and then he died, and you know, and there was just this really kind of poignant account of that, you know, the kind of the deathbed marriage that they had. And you got the sense that Cunningham was kind of a quiet guy because the reporter went and told Jefferson, you know, hey, did you hear that Cunningham got married? Jefferson was like, Cunningham got married? That doesn't sound like him. And, you know, he was dead the next day. So again, these really kind of sad stories. Two questions here. Would places have had rooms above, or was that rare? Yeah, almost all these places had rooms above them. There's one figure, I forget which chapter it's in, but like 90% of every bar owner lived above the bar that they owned. And I think that was the case with Cunningham and Jefferson too, that at least one of them lived over the Eureka, because you could follow their addresses through the city directories, and they would usually correspond to the addresses of the bars. Jonathan Garrity asked if the Eureka bar segregated in the 1870s. I mean, it was a de facto segregation. It was, I mean, I think I get the sense, and it's hard to know with any certainty how integrated it was, but I mean, it seemed like it was primarily an African-American bar, which is not to say that, you know, there weren't white folks in there occasionally, but the sense that I get it was really, you know, it was really kind of created for the Black community and mostly patronized by the Black community. Bill, did you come across anything?
Yeah, I would throw in the 1870s in St. Paul, there was still a kind of a culture of the, you know, mixed, even fur trade type stuff, like, because a lot of St. Paul had been settled by a more diverse population that it ended up being after a lot of immigration came. So I kind of imagine that a place like the Eureka would have had a mixed clientele of all sorts of different people.
Yeah, and kind of to that point, Stephen Griffith asked what it took to get a liquor license, and were they limited in number, and how much did they cost? And yeah, that's one of the things about the Eureka that kind of made it stand out is of the 312 saloons that were operating in 1887, the only one that was owned by, where a license was granted to Black owners, was the Eureka. They raised the price of the license to $1,000, which at the time would have been just an exorbitant amount of money.
Yeah, the licenses were a big way that people in government tried to crack down on a lack of sobriety in the population. So saloons were, you know, seen as a problem by many people, especially the business community and the church and religious community. And they were, like, people drank a lot in the 19th century.
Yeah, kind of to the point of being a public health crisis. I mean, it was really, you know, there was a lot of alcoholism. But especially when we get to Minneapolis, you'll see how the liquor licenses are really kind of weaponized for political and social purposes, and in a pretty blatant way.
And I see this other question, Andy, is about closing times and set hours. I actually don't know about when they would have closed at night, but I do know that liquor bars open on Sundays was a hot button politically for a while.
Yeah, most of the bars were closed on Sundays. And in fact, you get a lot of accounts of like a lot of the times when these places turn up in the public record, it's because they were open on Sunday and a cop was walking by and slapped a fine on them, and it got written up in the paper.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite bars that's still around. It, in fact, is the oldest bar in St. Paul to this day. There's an older bar in North St. Paul, or at least they claim to be. But the Spot Bar is a wonderful little joint on Randolph Avenue that dates back to 1887. So that's just so rare in the United States, especially this part of Minnesota, to have a place that's been around that long. Do you have a photo of it, Andy? Oh yeah, there it is. So I'm a frequent goer to the Spot Bar.
Goer tour, I think is the word.
Goer tour. And it's a lovely little joint. And I'll just talk about. I described this painting in the chapter, but it's a painting that was done by a patron, and it hangs up on the wall. And he apparently painted it. And so you can see the longtime owner. I think his name is Michael O'Toole, and the bar is still owned by the bartender owner's wife, who keeps it in his memory. Mr. O'Toole died at some point. I'm not sure when, maybe 10, 15 years ago. But I was sitting at the bar and commenting on this painting, and someone, the bartender, looks up and says, "Oh yeah, well, George there, right next to you, is in the painting." And I turn and I look and I see an old guy, and it might be one of the younger men here at the bar, and he's sitting next to me. And he's in the exact same pose that he was in the painting. So I just kind of like it. But this place is a lot of character. The jukebox is still there. Researching the history of it, I learned at one point there was an organ player that was in the back corner. You see, I saw this in an old movie once. Like I think it was the movie The Long Goodbye, a Robert Altman 70s film. So where you go into a bar and then there's like a karaoke setup, kind of like at Nye's Polonaise Room back when it was still the old Nye's, and someone to play the organ, and then you'd sing along songs. And apparently that was true here at the Spot Bar as well. And the reason I know that is because there are newspaper clippings that are shellacked on like placards along the side of the walls of this bar today. And they have some stories by this guy who was a columnist for the Pioneer Press named Gareth Hebert, but his pen name was Oliver Town. And apparently he used to hang out at the Spot Bar a lot because he wrote a lot of columns about the Spot Bar and what people were discussing in the 70s and 80s back at this place. And so because they're shellacked on the wall, that's a great way to do research. You just literally go in and get a beer and sit down, and you can read about the bar while you're sitting there in the booth. So yeah, I don't know. It's everyone should go there when COVID's over. They're open now. They put plexiglass in between the booths, which I don't know is sort of symbolic. But yeah, it's St. Paul's oldest bar.
Yeah, if we'd written this book 6 months later, I think we would have had to have included a chapter about some of the modifications that have been made to bars in the last couple of months.
Yeah, here's another St. Paul classic joint, the Halftime Rec, which is there's a couple different bars in the book that were featured in films. So a bar that's gone now that is called the King of Clubs. It was in Northeast Minneapolis. Was the setting for a scene in the movie Fargo, and this was during the Halftime Rec, which is there a photo of it, Andy? Here it's on Front Street in a kind of historic neighborhood in St. Paul. I call it the North End, but it really is a unique spot on Front Avenue. I know about this place because when I was growing up as a teenager, my family took me to go do square dancing and folk dancing much like you see in this photo right here, except these two are doing Irish dancing. But it was a bar that started as a recreation hall. So if you picture it full of pool tables or whatever. And one of its more interesting features is that there's in the basement a weird bocce court that I think some Italian American St. Paulite had created on a whim. And it's sort of musty, and it's surrounded by the limestone walls of the basement that dates to the 19th century, I'm sure. And then you play bocce in the basement. But
yeah, if we'd had a scratch and sniff option on the book, I think that would have been one of the top scents. Like the smell of the bocce courts at the halftime rack is one of the most evocative I can think of.
This is a good chance to talk about the photography research. It was probably some of the most fun stuff that we did, because we would find the Star Tribune would send people to cover stories, and in order to get photographs in the Star Tribune into the book, what you have to do is look up what the date of the article would have been. So, in this case, it's like, I don't know, 1986, March 4th or whatever, right? And then you go to this very dusty boxes that they keep in the very back of the Historical Society library. And you fill out a little form, and one of the library staff brings to you this giant cardboard box, and you open it up, and there's just envelopes. It's crammed full of envelopes full of photo negatives that are all the archives from the Star Tribune photographers.
They're all organized by date. Oh, sorry, Bill. I don't want to step on.
They're organized by date, and they're organized by the name of the photographer.
So, like, at the end of the day, you can just imagine that, like, any film they would have shot that day basically goes into an envelope, and so you would have to use your kind of psychological acuity to sort of like reverse engineer, when the photographs would have taken. So if it appeared March 4th, you have to think, okay, so was the photographer there March 2nd, maybe March 3rd? There was a couple where it ended up being like he was there the week before, and maybe the story was going to run, and then it got bumped, and so it was just, and again, these were negative, so you couldn't, just look at them and see if they were going to be useful or not. You'd have to, kind of take them over to the light table and get the loop and kind of, check each one.
Yeah, so this story was written by a young, scrappy reporter named R.T. Ryback at the Star Tribune newspaper.
Wonder whatever happened to him.
Yeah, he actually played a role in the book as a mayor. But and then he got a photographer come and take pictures of the halftime. And one of the commenters, Mary McKay, correctly describes what happened at the halftime. So there's obviously a rich Irish culture in St. Paul that dates way back to the 1840s, and some of the first people who ever came to St. Paul were Irish. And so there's sort of a rich, thriving Irish cultural music and folk scene that has moved around the city quite a bit. So McCafferty's was a bar that closed downtown St. Paul, and then the whole band and all the fans moved to the halftime. The owner decided it was okay to have Irish people come in, and now the place is known as an Irish bar and has a big St. Patrick's Day blowout, of course. And it's even where the Irish Institute, or the Irish, there's an Irish society that does the Irish Fair in St. Paul every year, or at least until this year, where nothing happens. And they were sort of loosely organized around the halftime for a while. So I just love these photos because you capture that spirit, and those, the sandals and shorts guy. I'm enjoying him, and it's just you can see the crap on the floor there, and it's really wonderful.
Sorry, Bill, you're
here's
kind of
another one.
back to back St. Paul joints here.
Yeah, do you wanna just chronologically switch it around, and you wanna do one?
Andy, yeah, sure. So I'll jump ahead here a little bit. Okay, yeah, I'll talk about the Cassius Bar. The Cassius Bar is another one of these instances of just finding a really amazing character and kind of following his or her life through the bar. And the amazing character in question here is Cassius himself, Anthony Brutus Cassius, who had come up from the South in the early part of the century and had gotten a job at the hotel, I think the West Hotel, I think as a dishwasher in the kitchen, and immediately kind of got into unionizing and organizing. And so he was, one of the kind of key labor folks for the hotel industry and the service industry, and a lot of the organizing that went around then. And he was based around like 4th Avenue and 38th Street in South Minneapolis. Not at all far from where Cup Foods, the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department, occurred. And historically, that section of Minneapolis is a major African American section of the town. The spokesman recorder is still there, and so he was there, and he owned a cafe there, and he owned another bar elsewhere. But what he really wanted to do was open like a nice bar, like with where people would come in for dinner, and they could get like pork chops and steaks, and they could get martinis and aviations and sidecars and all the other fancy cocktails that people drank at that time. And so he was in 2 different locations. Starting in 1949 is when he opened the Cassius Bar, and that was a long process, because you get back to the conversation about liquor licenses. I always thought of liquor licenses at this time as kind of ghosts, where they would move from host body to host body, and the only way it could leave the host body is if the host body died or got arrested or something like that. And that's usually what happened. There were a set number of liquor licenses, and if a place got shut down or the person decided to sell it, it would go to somebody else. And the person who the people that made the decision about where that was going to go was the city council and the public kind of health commission. And there was not a hard liquor bar at the time that was owned by an African American, and so the Minneapolis City Council found all these reasons to not grant Cassius a license that weren't like explicitly racist, but were just sort of like, well, doesn't his nephew already own a place, and isn't there someone else that wants to own one, and also this isn't really a good neighborhood for it. And he made a very forceful argument, and eventually actually kind of in a way that was related to civil rights, kind of made the civil rights case that he should be permitted to have one. And so he was granted one in 1949. He owned and operated the first Cassius Bar from 1949 to 1958, and then the city demolished the building in 1958 and moved into another building on 3rd Street. It's the problem with downtown Minneapolis addresses and bars is it's just so hard to picture where these places are, because the entire landscape looks so different. and it's just kind of, I can't think in my mind like, okay, 3rd Avenue and 3rd Street, where is that exactly?
And it's also just the bar area of downtown Minneapolis got completely demolished, and there's no building standing from where all the bars were located.
And yeah, we'll talk about that. But you can see that this is like a pretty like upscale crowd. Like these are folks like they're coming in like nice clothes, and like having again like sidecars and martinis. And I guess there's no martinis in this picture, but certainly mixed drinks. There's a cup of champagne the woman on the right is drinking. And another one of the kind of great like side things. This picture didn't make it in the book, unfortunately. But I can't remember why not.
That's a great picture.
Well, there's a whole subgenre of like bar art, like art that you find in bars. And so this was a mural that was commissioned by Cassius, by a guy who had been a boxer. It was called the Rondo Street Jinx, and he had a second career as a painter. And so this is Sugar Ray Robinson and Carmen Basilio. There were these 4 murals in the Cassius of kind of, great moments in African American athletic achievement. I think there was like a Jackie Robinson one, and I think maybe like, the Sugar Ray Robinson one, and probably a Joe Louis, I think. And one of these, I forget which one it is. I think maybe it's the Joe Louis one, but actually Cassius had been at that, and so they painted him into the front row, and he's got like blood all over his face because it was such a violent fight. And when it closed down in 1980, it really is a kind of generational thing, because there was a long interview with him, and he was just this really kind of respected, pillar of the community. He knew all the politicians, and they asked him why he closed, and he was like, well, the kids just want to like smoke marijuana these days. They're not interested in getting a sidecar, which is not untrue. That is definitely the way things were going in 1980. So, you do see these generational shifts. Speaking of the bars of the Gateway District, let's see here. This is the Great Lakes Bar and Fun House at First and Nicollet. So this is right where the what used to be the ING building. I forget what it's called now, but you know the building. 1949 to 1960. So, you know, some of you that are a little older perhaps may remember the Gateway District, what was called Skid Row at the time, which is, you know, basically Hennepin, Nicollet, Washington. That is where if you were, you know, an itinerant worker that was working on the railroad or, you know, like harvesting weed up in North Dakota, you know, you'd come back during the off months and you would live in a single occupancy room, you know, over a bar, and you would spend most of your day drinking. And so you had this really kind of rich culture of, you know, it actually sounds like a pretty, I guess, varied culture of, you know, downtown workers and kind of railroad workers and agricultural workers and, you know, I mean, all sorts of just folks from every walk of life. And the Great Lakes Bar and Fun House was one such place. This was one of those situations where I managed to track down the daughter of the guy that had owned the place. The Great Lakes in particular was owned by a Croatian immigrant that had come to the United States and had dreamed of opening a bar and did indeed open a bar. And so when I say it's a fun house, like you think, oh, okay, so it's like a fun house where like people have fun and it's a house. Well, no, it was actually a literal fun house. John Subak was the name of the owner, and he just seems to have had a really kind of very goofy, very kind of Midwestern, mid-century sense of humor. So in the back, he actually opened a funhouse where there were like guys jumping out in gorilla suits, and there was like, you know, puffs of air coming up from the floor to blow the dresses up, and you know, like funhouse mirrors. And in the front there was just wacky stuff going on all the time too. There was a floor show that they had often where, you know, they'd put on like a saxophone record and a guy would come out like pantomiming like this sweaty impassioned sax solo, but he'd be playing a kielbasa. And you know, like the ashtrays were all like hospital bedpans. And it was, you can kind of get a sense for that. Like if you go into the bathroom, apparently there were all these kind of ribald things that you would see. Don't hold it too long. Look, gals, here's a strange one. That's
There's
pretty
actually still a bathroom like that at Newman's in North St. Paul, which is another old school bar.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, Jonathan Garrity says Hall of Mirrors and Cocktail sounds like a dangerous combination. It was. I think one of the best stories that I came across was, I don't know, you hear all these stories today about how, you know, oh, youth are kind of trapped in this arrested development and you know, nobody asks their age and all that kind of thing. But there was a story about a guy, there was a fire one night, like kind of a not serious fire, but there was a fire at the Great Lakes and they had to call in the, you know, the fire department and like evacuate everybody. And this one guy was just having such a great night. And he was so mad that he got kicked out that he knocked out two firefighters and ran back in while the fire was still going. I don't know what he was going to do there. He was just going to keep like hanging out or just like work around the flames. And they had to drag him out just because he was just having too good a night and just didn't want the fun to stop. But John Subak had, I mean, I think it kind of speaks actually to the community that was around at that in that place and time, because, you know, Skid Row gets a bad rap. Obviously, it was like definitely a seedy, dangerous place, but there were, you know, folks there that knew each other, and so when the city condemned the Gateway District in 1960, and the Great Lakes was forced to close, like a couple other bars. You know, he didn't know what he was going to do. There was no payout from the city. It was a, you know, there was no kind of payout that he was going to get. So one of his regulars, apparently, just all according to his daughter, just made a handshake deal with him, you know, loaned him some money to get back on his feet and open a new place. And he did. And apparently he paid the guy back in full. And, you know, because the guy that lent him the money knew that he was good for it. And the bar that John Subak actually opened was the 5-8 Club in Minneapolis, the other home of the Juicy Lucy. And I think there's probably an interesting story there too, but I did not get that story, whatever it was.
Cool. Let's go back to some of the ones we skipped over at this point. Let's see. The Nickel Joint is another bar that's still around, and it's in Frogtown. So it's actually located a block from St. Agnes Catholic Church. And I got the sense that there's not a coincidence that the bars and the churches would be located near each other, because that's what community is all about. In fact, after church, you would go there. And is there a photo of it, Andy, too? Yeah, it's oh, sure. So that's the first time I heard about this bar was because of the baseball museum that was in the back. There's this big event room in the back of the Nickel Joint Bar where this society that's in St. Paul to this day, it's called the Old Timers Baseball Association, meets there and has met there for decades and decades, once a month during the off season. So generally November to May, or maybe April. Anytime there wasn't baseball. And this society was started in like the 1920s by some minor leaguers for the New York Yankees who were in the Yankees system. And they were bored during winter and wanted to get together in St. Paul. And so they began meeting at bars around the city, and it just kind of kept going. And as baseball shifted throughout St. Paul and in Minnesota, they evolved as well. So now they're sort of a Twins fan group, and they did these. So they meet every month, and sort of there's usually like a discussion of the minutes and the budget, and there's pictures of very, very cheap lager, American lager that you can drink. And then there's usually a trivia contest and some sort of story about like a famous baseball player in Minnesota history. And so they've had apparently multiple mayors have been members of this society, and they have guest speakers come in who are maybe former pro ball players or umpires or whatever, and talk about stories that they know. So anyway, the back room of the Nickel Joint was, until about 2 years ago, covered in these photos of baseball teams that had been around in the early 20th century in St. Paul. So back in the early 20th century, every business would, host a team, and they would. So if you had a shop, like one of them was the Tool and Derrick, the Derrick and Joint company. Like they're still around, I think, over on the riverfront. But they would have 9 players in classic old school baseball uniforms. And they would show the picture of their team. And so all the walls of this place were covered in these old photos, and it's very, very cool to see that. And so this is, I think, one of the uniforms of the Nickel Joint Club, baseball club. So it was really neat to be in this place and see all the history of all the different ball teams that go back in St. Paul for 100 years or more. And the bar was sold to Ethiopian 2 guys from Ethiopia a couple of years ago, and they wanted to use the back room for events. So they preserved some of the baseball history. I imagine 100-year-old baseball history doesn't mean a whole lot to new Ethiopian immigrants. So someone, I actually went in and talked to the guy a couple times about it, but he did save the photos, and they're kept in a closet. And then a couple of them are on the wall still that you can see. And so it's kind of an interesting place to go and see that. And then here's another bar in St. Paul that is sort of famous, the Commodore Hotel. So this is near the cathedral on Cathedral Hill, Ramsey Hill. And the Commodore Hotel, it reopened, thankfully, a couple years ago. So you can go back there again today. But it had been a sort of a residential hotel for most of its life. Like a hotel that you stay at for a year, maybe, or a month, but for a period of time. And famously, F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald stayed there in the 1930s, before the end of the Prohibition. So there might have been a speakeasy in the basement, but they might have just been drinking moonshine there. And so all the cocktails that are at the Commodore that are branded with F. Scott Fitzgerald are probably not accurate entirely. The famous incident that happened at the Commodore. So it was sort of a swinging place to hang out in the 1970s, apparently. There was a kind of jazz in the 1980s as well. So there's a jazz band that played there all the time, and you'd go and have cocktails, and it was sort of part of this renaissance of the Ramsey Hill area, which had been in decline for quite a while. And then sort of historic preservationists and longtime residents sort of managed to turn the neighborhood around, and it started to get nicer. And this was one of the pivotal places that played a role in that story. But there was a big gas leak. So this photo that you're looking at right now is what happened after an explosion. And I'm trying to find the year. I think I have to find what chapter. There it is. 1978. So it was kind of extreme. The building was pretty old, and the heater, the gas started getting out, and the way that the story was told in the newspaper, quite a bit. The one particular janitor was running through the hotel and knocking on all the doors and getting all the people out at the last minute. And there was a small explosion, and that's what triggered everybody to start panicking. And then they tried to get everybody out of the building. And then the whole thing just blew, and all the windows blew out, and the houses across the street blew out as well. And somehow the building did not get destroyed. And so it's still there today. And now it's condos, I believe. And there's a restaurant. I don't know if they're open right now. But yeah, Peter points out that August Wilson wrote some of his plays while sitting at the bar at the Commodore. The Commodore bar is a really beautiful spot. It's Art Deco. So it was remodeled at some point in, I think, the 1940s. Yeah, after Prohibition, when a lot of places were sort of rebooting after that long bar-free time in our country's life. And so it was sort of remodeled. There was actually the same guy designed the Commodore Hotel, the Lexington on Grand Avenue, and this place that was called the Townhouse, which is now called the Black Heart on University Avenue. And he was a Hollywood set designer, and he was he had a German name. I have to look it up. I don't remember it offhand, but he did all those places, and they're all sort of campy and sort of wonderful in retrospect.
Yeah, and it does. The thing that I like about that place is it really does look like a 1980s version of a 1930s film set, or it looks like a 2010s version of a 1980s vision of a 1940s film set.
Yeah, it's a really unique environment, and I'm glad it's been restored and reopened to the public. So it sat sort of empty, or you could rent it for private events for a couple decades, and then it got rebooted about 3 years ago, I think.
So I'm going to power through these last two. We're going to do the power hour here, the 12 to 1 o'clock, just turned 21. The Red Baron, 2017 6th Street, 1966 to 1969. You might be thinking, the Red Baron, where? Yeah, kind of an obscure place. The reason why this is included is because this is one of those things where the research kind of drives what's going to go in the book. So I was looking through the bar and restaurant files at the Hennepin County Library in the Minneapolis collection, because they have, just kind of clippings from the newspapers, community newspapers, the Strib, Pioneer Press. And there was one envelope that I came across that said first woman bartender, 1966. And I thought, gee, 1966 seems kind of late to have the first woman bartender. But indeed, that was the case. This is Judy Jaroszak. At the time, women were not permitted to be bartenders in the city of Minneapolis. They were permitted to be cocktail waitresses, which is a very different kind of situation, obviously. But Judy Jaroszak was a member, again, because we're doing this at the Eastside Freedom Library, we always gotta point to the union and labor angle. She was a member of the waitresses and the waiters union. And she wanted to join the bartenders union because she had been working at, I think it was one of the downtown, I think it was the Ritz Sheraton across from where the library is now. But she was a cocktail waitress there, and she knew how to mix drinks, and she wanted to get a job as a bartender. She was putting herself through school to get a sociology degree. She was a single mother. She was divorced. And so she passed the test and apparently got the highest, the highest commendations in the history of the bartending admission test. And so for one night, she was hired by these guys at this place called the Red Baron, which had replaced another bar that was called The Office. And you know why it's called The Office? It's like that mid-century joke where you call your wife and you're like, hey, I'll be working late at the office tonight. And apparently, this is a side discretion, they actually had like sound effects, of typewriters in the background by the phone, so it would sound like you were at the office. I don't know if that's true or not. Anyway, that place burned down, and so these guys bought it, opened a place called the Red Baron, which had kind of that kitschy like mid-60s like World War One kind of theme that eventually became like kind of the TGI Fridays like style of kind of bar decor. But anyway, so Judy Jaroszak worked there for one night, and they were going to use it as a test case. Because they thought that when she was working her one night there, that the vice squad was going to come in and arrest her, and they were going to be able, the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union was going to be able to use it as a test case. But what they actually ended up doing is giving a citation to the bar owners, and there was a court case, and eventually it was overturned, and women were permitted to be bartenders in the city of Minneapolis. But as for Judy Jaroszak herself, I don't actually know what happened to her. I really tried to track her down, and she kind of vanishes from the historical record after like a year. And she got a lot of publicity, and it wasn't good publicity necessarily. I mean, it's probably a pretty rotten thing to like, have your picture like splashed across the pages of the, the newspaper and be the kind of the subject of like this kind of intense interest and gossip. Single divorced mom putting herself through, university doesn't need that. So she kind of disappeared. And the reason why the Red Baron was only in operation for 3 years is not because having a woman bartender scandalized the place. It burned down. You think, the 60s, that's not actually that long ago, but it is kind of a long time ago. And there was still, I think you're still looking at this building stock that, kind of came up in the early 20th century that was just very flammable. And so it burned down, basically. And that was the end of it. An interesting thing about the Red Baron is that there was a place next to it called Vincent Van Gogh, which I think is maybe of all the great names that we encountered of establishments in this process, I think Vincent Van Gogh is way up there.
As long as they like follow through with the decor inside, I think that works.
Who knows what the inside of the Vincent Van Gogh looked like. But so yeah, a short time for the Red Baron. And the last one I'll just talk about really quick is just, I think, one of my favorites. Just this is getting into like living memory now. If any of you actually went to the Left Guard, please chime in the comments, because I'm obsessed with this place. The Left Guard was opened by a couple of Green Bay Packers, and I think there's people here that probably know the Green Bay Packers better than I do, but it was two of the guys from the Ice Bowl team. But they opened, it's actually, if you know where, I think it's the Menards down like at, down in Richfield at, where did I say it was? Nicollet and 77th, down that way. And it was an old Piggly Wiggly. So it was just this warehouse. And apparently at the time, it was the most profitable singles bar in the country, not in the region, not in the state, not in the Midwest, in the whole country. Apparently there were 3,000 people in there on a really busy night, which is just impossible to imagine that level of kind of grinding humanity. And it was a place for like people at the time that were considered to be older. And by older, I mean in their early 30s. So it was definitely the kind of, this is the sexual revolution coming to the suburbs of the Twin Cities. Again, which is funny because like, it was a place opened by two former Green Bay Packers, and the decor sounds exactly like what you would expect two former Green Bay Packers to decorate a restaurant like. There was like big images of like Minnesota Vikings, on the wall, and like the bartenders wore, apparently like kind of football jerseys, and it just sounds like it was a really kind of funny place. It got a write-up in Time magazine, and I think if I may, the best quote that we have in the book, if I can find it here.
Andy, look at this picture. There's the two collars on this one guy who's checking out the girls.
He's going in for the kill.
Oh my
right?
God, the double collar, and then the light fixtures are so classic 70s.
They look like the knives.
Yeah, they absolutely do. You can see it's in black and white, but I can see that brownish orange color through the photo.
Yeah, and the photos of this place also came from that the kind of the Star Tribune dump, and you get the sense that these photos have probably not seen the light of day for, maybe ever. Mary McKay says the cocktails. So when did cocktails go out? Bill, do you want to address that? I mean, I have some ideas, but I don't
know. I mean, craft beer doesn't arrive until the late 80s in Minnesota.
And that's what Cassius says in 1980, is that by that time, the people that were coming to bars just weren't interested in cocktails anymore. They were interested in, like beer and wine. And so I think that cocktail culture really good. And I don't know, some of you that were drinking in the 80s probably remember what the cocktail culture was like. The Town Talk is in this bar too. And if some of you remember, in like the mid 2000s, late 2000s, the Town Talk was really kind of on the forefront of the craft cocktail movement. And the guys that were coming out of that, had worked in like, hotels and downtown restaurants, and like cocktail culture in the 80s is very like, it's like Tom Cruise, like flipping things behind his back and like setting stuff on fire, and like neon pink synthetic cocktails with very ribald names. So that's kind of what you're looking at. But the Left Guard had a profile written of it in Time magazine for whatever reason. Here's how it opened. Time magazine said we had a drink called the Thigh Opener. Left Guard General Manager Dick Smith complained to the Star Tribune in 1974, sounding extremely annoyed. Well, that's not true, and still isn't. We just call them vodka gimlets. I hope there's a peal of chuckles kind of going through the houses that are tuned into this. But yeah, Wolfie Brauender says there was a Fuzzy Thurston's Left Guard in Glendale, Wisconsin, a Milwaukee suburb. My parents and grandparents took us there once when I was about 6. I have very vague memories of eating there in the mid-'60s, and it was the same chain. Fuzzy Thurston was the Green Bay Packer in question. And so, he opened a couple of these, I think in a few different places in the Midwest, but the one in the Twin Cities, for whatever reason, was the largest. And as far as the capacity, which someone else is asking about, Jonathan Garrity's asking about the bar's capacity, it was outrageous. Let me see if I can find the exact figure.
Yeah, there were there's a football bar in downtown St. Paul, still to this day, called Allery's, that was started by a former Chicago Bears player named Al something or other, and his partner was Larry, so that's why it's called Allery's. And so football players or sports figures would start bars. That's a pretty normal thing that still happens today, I think.
Yeah, but they just don't always turn into like, kind of pivot points for the sexual revolution. But here they did. I don't know what the exact capacity was, but on a like above average night, it was 1,500, and like on a good night, it was 3,000. So it's
a lot of people.
A lot of people.
Plus, I think like the 494 strip was pretty hot back in that period.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. I mean, that was kind of the point where you're starting to hear about Bloomington as being kind of the third hub in the tertiary cities. And it was like, Met Stadium was right there and the airport was right there. So it was really like a combination of like pilots and flight attendants and like, football players, and just like really the kind of the cream of the 70s scene. Oh, and Stephen Griffin said he was there when it was Maximilian's. It was huge. Yeah, so it closed. It became Maximilian's, which was kind of like a Mexican themed bar and restaurant. And Maximilian's eventually beget Chi-Chi's. And so Chi-Chi's as a fast casual concept was born right here at the Left Guard.
That's famous Mexican culture of Bloomington.
Oh, right. What a journey from a singles bar and a Piggly Wiggly owned by 2 former Green Bay Packers to a fast casual Mexican restaurant by the stadium. Like that is the journey of a lifetime.
Well, I don't know if there's more questions. How much longer we should just keep blabbing. The book is got 50 stories like this, and we barely scratched the surface of what's in here. So if you don't already have a copy, you definitely should get one because it's good.
It's true.
Are there questions from anyone in the audience today about stuff that we talked about or didn't talk about?
Stuff that we missed is always something we're interested in hearing about.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about like anything about the 1918 flu pandemic.
Did that
come up?
No, well, not in the research. I wish it had now. Yeah, so to Jonathan Garrity's point, no, the bars were forced to close, and it was an extremely contentious issue, as it is today. At the time too, the flu pandemic is kind of coming in perfect confluence with World War I and kind of prohibition about to start. And if you look at drinking, if you look at World War I, and you look at the pandemic, you're kind of looking at this sort of pan-European sort of othering, right? Like, so a lot of these bars are run by Germans, and of course we're fighting the Germans in World War I. And so there's a lot of anti-German sentiment. And so a lot of the kind of forcing the bars to close through the public health order, I think probably had a lot to do with the fact that so many of the bars were owned by Germans. Which makes me sound like the 1918 version of like a QAnon conspiracy theory.
There's a gender thing too with a lot of women, and the suffrage movement that Robin was talking about at the beginning was very closely tied with the temperance movement. So when women got the right to vote, also it helped sort of seal the deal for bars and prohibition. What was the impact of prohibition? Well, the bars mostly closed. You could get a lot of them turned into pharmacies, which was
or soda pop shops, like soft drinks.
Yeah, and the speakeasies to some degree. But pharmacies could give alcohol to people if you had a prescription, which is sort of funny.
Prohibition did really, I think it did a couple of different things. It actually, I don't know, I didn't think about this until now, but thinking about like World War I, it really kind of de-Germanized bars in an interesting way. I mean, I think before Prohibition, you think of bars as being very, especially bars that are serving beer. You see them as being very. A lot of them are owned by Germans. They're patronized by Germans, and so there's a really kind of German quality to them that I don't know, kind of goes away actually after Prohibition, because it really does. It's like a hard reset. So few places survived.
But when Prohibition was over in 1933, I think the floodgates of places that opened up, that it was all very exciting for people, and just most of the bars in the book that are still around got their start in 1934. So they all opened at the same time. What's a spot that we researched that we really wish we could have visited? Andy, do you have an answer to that question?
I do. I super apologize if this is going to make anyone sound old, but the new French bar in the 1980s, which some of you probably went to once or twice, it just sounded like a really fun, cool place for cool, arty people. And as a person that has always strived to fit that description, it just sounds like it was a really, really fun place. I got to talk to a couple of the folks that were, involved in opening it and building it, and just just that there was so much intentionality around the way that the space was designed, and just the way that they kind of handled customers. And it was one of the first places where you could get like a Summit beer in town. It was one of the first places where it had a patio where you could bring a dog. So, I mean, it's just like so much of it sounds so 21st century. But that's my answer.
Yeah, my answer would be Moby Dick's bar in downtown Minneapolis. I would like to go there in like about the year I was born, 1979, just to see. The descriptions of it are very exciting to me. And it's just sort of a lost slice of downtown that I don't think there is anything that is like that today. The other effect of Prohibition was on the beer industry, and the reason there was a lot of consolidation during that period, where the breweries that could stay open grew very large afterwards, and a lot of the small ones shut down.
Yeah, and there was a whole, one of the things that went away, I think, to some extent after Prohibition is the idea of the Tide House. A lot of these bars were kind of propped up by local brewers, where the breweries would pay for the fixtures and the interiors and everything, and they would just supply the beer, and it was only the beer from that brewery that was available there.
Yeah, and a fun detail about that is if you go to certain bars, you'll see the same floor tile on them. So there's like the Viking bar on the West Bank, and Palmer's bar, and like another one in Northeast, all have the same brown and white tile. And it's because they were all owned by the same brewery, and they would hire the same contractors to build all of them. So you could kind of use the floor tile as like a secret Dakota ring for the history of the place.
Yeah, people's moms, and dads, and uncles, and aunts
The
still talking
story
about
about Moby
Dicks.
Dicks that is really, really hard to believe is, but I believe it, is that if you went in there with the Alcoholics Anonymous bracelet, or medal or whatever they give you for being sober for a period of time, and you gave it to the bartender, they would give you the rest of your drinks for free that day, and they would nail it up on the wall. So that's not ideal for public health, but it's certainly kind of amusing for
colorful
alcoholics to talk about.
It's a line you have to walk when you're writing a book like this, like between kind of like fun, colorful stories and like sort of human suffering.
Yeah. We did a reading actually, the opening, our kickoff party, where the bouncer from Moby Dicks actually came to the reading, and so he was in the book, a guy named Clarence, and he showed up and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's me." And so he actually sort of bounced Andy from the stage at one point.
He gave it. I asked him to give a demo of how you would effectively kind of bounce somebody, and it was great because it was not the strong arm. It was really like this kind of persistent, subtle application of force, the kind of a cajoling mixed with a sort of like just a kind of gentle application of brute force, which is a very effective way to bounce somebody, it turns out.
Another sort of local story, if you're from St. Paul and on the east side, the closest one to the Freedom Library actually was the Pain Reliever, which was a strip club and bar that was in St. Paul east side staple for decades, I believe. And so the book has a little bit of history of that place and some of the battles between the city council and the bar owner, who was a real character.
Obviously, we could talk about this all night. We'd be happy to, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and Robin and Peter and all the nice folks at the RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library.
Well, thank you, Bill and Andy. This was a fantastic talk. And again, thank you everyone for coming or giving us your time at home for this wonderful program. And please check out both of our websites for upcoming programs, and also check out our partners, Subtext Books. They have been wonderful partners with us carrying the books for our History Revealed program. So again, thank you, Bill and Andy, and thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library. Please come back again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks. See you around.
Thank you.